Thank you, Eric, for that introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm indeed going to look at the question, well, once we progress to autonomous ships, do we still need a mass master? If you walk into a bar and you start talking about general average or demerge, they're only going to let you stay if you buy the drinks. If you talk about the master, everybody knows what, or thinks they know what you're talking about. A master, that's a figure that everybody has heard about, and not just lawyers, maritime lawyers, but even people in popular culture. Now, we have seen, and that is an evolution that started a long time ago, we have seen crew sizes reducing. In the 1950s, you had crews of 40, 50 people. Now we're talking less than 20. And that is going to continue, if only because we don't find the people anymore who want to go to sea. That is going to continue until at the end, we might end up with fully autonomous vessels with no crew members on board anymore. And thus the obvious question is, well, if that is the case, if there's no crew anymore, do we then still need a master or mass master? If you look at the IMO MSC, if you look at the draft mass code, then I could stop right here because they clearly think that the answer is yes, that we still need a mass master. You've seen the reasons several times before already, so I'm not going to dwell on it. IMO seems to think that a human master is always required, regardless of operation degree of autonomy. Master doesn't necessarily need to be on board, except if there are other persons on board, then the master apparently does need to be on board. And maybe even more importantly, such a mass master must always have the means to intervene when necessary. I think that as academics, we're at least entitled to ask ourselves, is that really true? Right? Is IMO on the right track here or not? First issue, of course, is, well, when we're talking about a master, what exactly are we talking about? How do you define a master? If you look at the maritime law conventions, quite a number of conventions that refer to the master, that impose obligations, duties on the master, but without defining the term. They simply talk about the master, but there's no definition. There are also quite a number of conventions that have mandatory rules of maritime law, but simply do not mention the master at all. So it is possible to create maritime law without referring to the master. The only convention that I've found that actually has a definition is the SCCW, which says the master means the person having command of a ship. In my written paper, you'll also find some references to domestic legislation where you have very similar definitions. So definition-wise, I don't think that there really is a big problem. Who is the master, legally speaking? Well, the master is the person who either formally or actually, in fact, is in command of a vessel. That is the master. Okay, that's one step. Next step, of course, is to see, well, what do we need this master for? What those conventions that refer to the master, what kind of obligations are they imposing on the master? A couple of introductory remarks before. Why has maritime law traditionally referred to, why are the conventions referring to the master? From a historical perspective, that is very easy to understand. That's perfectly logical. Why? In the old days of the sailing ships, no means of communication. Well, the master was the ultimate authority on board. Hence the expression, master under God. Above the master, there was no one, there was only God. So if the moment that legislators start to impose duties, impose obligations on a vessel, basically, well, who are you going to give those duties, those obligations to? Well, not to the second mate and not to the engineer in the engine room, obviously to the person on top of the hierarchical pyramid, to the master. That being said, when conventions talk about tasks that they impose on the master, the focus is not on the part of the sentence that says on the master. The focus is on the task. There is a task that needs to be accomplished. That is the relevant issue. And who are we going to give that task to? Well, obviously to the master. It doesn't really matter whether you give it to the master or to someone else. Actually, if you look at practice today on traditional manned ships, many of those tasks that maritime law conventions entrust to the master, so to speak, are actually not performed by the master himself. They are actually performed by other persons under the ultimate responsibility of the master. If the second mate screws up and runs into a fishing ship, it will ultimately be the master who ends up in court and who might be held liable. Obviously, the master is simply humanly unable to do all of those tasks himself. To be officer of the watch 24/7, that simply isn't possible. Let's have a quick overview of the different tasks and obligations that you find in the conventions. Very obvious one is, of course, the safety of the vessel. Just as an example, Marple, for example, says no ballast water in cargo tanks, except when the master thinks that this is necessary for the safety of the vessel. Very obviously, very clearly, the master is responsible for the safety of the vessel. Again, in reality, that's not just the master's duty, that's a team effort. Everybody who is involved with the ship, on board, the crew members, but even ashore, all of that group of people needs to ensure the safety of the vessel. And that will actually simply be the same in case of a remotely operated, in case of a fully autonomous vessel. You will still have that group, that team of people who is responsible for the safety. Another type of duties, well, the master is the representative of the owner. For example, in the Salvage Convention, the master has the authority to sign salvage contracts. Why is that? Again, historical and very easy to understand. In those days, there was hardly any means of communication. So you had to have the master there, and he had to have the legal possibility to enter into contracts on behalf of the owner. Today, and that was the commercial courts commented on that in a recent case of the case Bonnie, with improved communications. Position now is that, whereas in the past, the master took the necessary decision to incur, for example, storage assistance. Today, master is able to communicate with his owners, and it is they, the owners, rather than the master, who take the relevant decision. So there, that duty has, in fact, already shifted. Other types of duties, there's a lot of information, both information that has to be provided by the master to, for example, authorities. There's also sometimes information that needs to be provided to the master. Again, purely as examples, Marple says if the estimated time of arrival changes by more than 6 hours, then the master needs to inform that of that revised ETA. Load Lines Convention, the master shall be supplied with sufficient information. You see, Marple already talks about the master, owner, or agent. But there you already have possible persons, which again illustrates it's not about the fact that the master needs to do something. It's about information. We need, coastal state wants information. That information obviously has to be correct, has to be reliable. But whether it's provided by the master or by the owner or by an agent, who cares? It's not about the person sending you the information, it's about the information as such. Information to the master, well, again, that will not basically change. Nowadays, loading, ballasting information, that needs to be provided to the master and actually to the entire crew, because they have to use that information. Will be the same in the age of autonomous vessels. Remote operators, if they are in charge of ballasting operations, they need to have that information. If you are a developer designing an autonomous system, well, you need to know what the vessel is capable of, what the vessel needs to do in way of ballast. And then if you look at still at the different duties and obligations, lots of record keeping, lots of paperwork, formalities, etc., that is now entrusted to the master. Just again, as an example, you have the oil record book, the ballast water record book, ship stores declarations, fuel oil samples that have to be signed. Sometimes the convention explicitly says that the master has to deliver a copy and certify that copy as a true copy. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's actually the master putting his signature on the oil sample or someone else. The point with a fuel oil sample, for example, is that you have a sample that you are sure that is indeed a sample of the fuel oil that was delivered, that is conserved, etc. Whatever that is done by the master or by someone else, that is not really the point. That brings me to what I really want to talk about. Do we really need a mass master? And I'll start off by saying that if you absolutely want a mass master, you can always appoint a mass master. If you're talking about remotely operated vessels, then you can say, well, this guy sitting there in the middle chair, that is now the master. This remote operator there, that's the mass master. Even with fully autonomous vessels, you can appoint a mass master. You can say, dear Mr. Johnson, you used to be the brand manager. Well, as of tomorrow, you're also the mass master of this other vessel. You can do that, but why? What do you want? What do you think you're going to accomplish by doing that? What problems have you actually solved by saying that Eric is the mass master of a vessel out in the, well, maybe not even the Adriatic Sea, but in the Caribbean Sea? What problem have you actually solved by doing that? And again, I know there are obviously different factual scenarios. There you have the remote operating center is manned and you have an operator actually navigating the ship. He's sitting behind the joystick. There have been experiments like that. I think that Boluda, a big towage company, once operated a tug in Spanish waters from the Netherlands or vice versa. I don't really remember. So there you have an operator sitting behind the joystick actually navigating the ship. You might actually have a sort of a hybrid between degree 3 and degree 4, where you have a manned operating system, where the ships are in principle on autopilot, and you have 1, 2, 3 operators just walking around. In principle, they're just letting the systems go, the ships go on autopilot. But in difficult situations, if you have to pass a lock, they'll take over. They do that manually. If there's an alarm, they respond to the alarm, etc. Degree 4, the ROC, wouldn't call it an ROC then probably anymore. Then the ROC is unmanned. Ships simply go autonomously. You will still need to have some sort of operations center in case something really goes wrong, and then you'll get a sort of emergency team in to see what they can do. But basically, there's no one there. Now, in that degree 3, the hybrid situation, you could say, well, those junior operators who are sitting there in the chair, those are the first and the second mates and what have you. And you have a sort of a senior operator, second tier, who's walking around supervising. And in difficult cases, you go to that one. Well, that senior operator is then the mass master. So again, if you really want to have a mass master, you can always have it. Question remains, why? Some of the arguments are, well, we need to have a human in control. And fully agree with Henrik's point that you will always have some connection to humans. I mean, if you have an autonomous system that has really no connection to the human world, well, then that's completely irrelevant. Who cares? So there will always be some points of contact with the human world. If we're talking about remotely operated vessels, well, then basically those operators are in control. That is already the case. In case of fully autonomous vessels, as I said, you will bring in sort of an emergency team to try and rectify the things. Obviously, such teams will have someone in control, a team leader, to call him that. Point is, does it really help to call that team leader a master? Because if you call him a master, then that brings along all of that history of the master, all sorts of implications that are not necessarily correct, that might actually create more confusion than that they are actually. Another reason why IMO and others are saying that we need this human in control might be because they think that the human is there to save the day, so to speak, when the computers fail. This is the Odysseus moon lander, which quite recently landed on its site. IUC already suggested to expand maritime law to space. Well, why did this incident happen? Well, obviously, because they didn't appoint a master. If they had appointed a master for this moon lander, he would have pushed the computer aside, jumped behind the joystick, and saved the day. Well, if you think that that is going to happen, think again, because that's completely unrealistic. The presentation of EMSA yesterday made it clear, by the way, that if you do involve humans, you actually create new problems. You then have human-machine interfaces. You need to deal with the transfer of control from the machine to the human, vice versa. And as the person from EMSA actually said, you then actually have to make the system resilient against human errors. You have to go to protect the system against human errors. So I don't think that that is the way to go. Another reason that is sometimes said, well, we need to have discipline. And discipline, that is really one of the key tasks of the masters. We'll need to discipline on board if you still have people on board. The hotel crew, for example, you might have a ship that is a cruise ship that is navigated fully autonomously, but you still have the cooks and the waiters and what have you and the bar people on board. So you might still have, and they need to have discipline. In the remote operating center, you need to have discipline. Yes, of course, but you don't need a master for that. I mean, you also need discipline on board of a drilling rig, in a polar research station, you name it. Everywhere where you have a group of people working together in a closed environment, you need discipline and you need someone in charge of discipline. Again, it doesn't really matter whether you call that person. It doesn't help to call that person who is in charge of discipline a master. Do we need a master for liability aspects? You can hold, in many legal systems, you can hold a master liable, civilly and criminally. Civil liability, well, actually, it's never going to be the master. The $300 million damage of Musk, if a master had been liable for that, I don't know any, maybe you, I don't know you that well enough, but most masters don't have $300 million. So in any case, it's the owner's insurance, civil liability. Criminal liability, on the other hand, that is a different animal, because it's a very human reaction to incidents, catastrophes. If something goes wrong, goes badly wrong, we need to have someone that we can throw in jail. That's purely human reaction. We want someone to punish really ostensibly. Another issue, well, the authorities want a point of contact. If something goes wrong, the authorities want someone to speak. That is a very valid concern for the authorities, obviously. If something happens here between the Isle of Lokrum and then the actual port, and you have a cruise ship on fire, the authorities obviously want someone to talk to. Traditional master is at the scene. A manned cruise ship, the master will be there, he can talk to the authorities. Mass master will be somewhere else, not on the scene. And you can see, it makes perfect sense for authorities, international legislators to say, well, the owner of a mass needs to have someone with decision-making powers who can be reached, who can be contacted 24/7, 365 days a year. But the same question always again, does it help to call that person a master? I'm going to conclude because I've already run into the merge, I see. I personally think that basically all of the duties, all of the obligations that maritime law, the international conventions nowadays attribute to the master can actually be shifted either to the owner as such, or possibly to a dedicated person within the owner's organization. Liability, and I think that Maritime was also basically saying that liability should be shifted to the owners and in reality, the owner's insurers. And what I personally certainly don't see as a sufficient or valid reason to say, well, we still need a master is the criminal liability of the master. That need or that desire to throw people in jail, let's forget about that. That's really not necessary. Or the hope that this human master is going to outperform computers in an emergency, that I think is completely unrealistic. So my personal view is that when we are progressing towards mass, indeed, the master will come to an end. Some people might find that a pity, but there are so many professions that have disappeared, and maybe the master is also one of those professions that is going to disappear. Thank you.